Welcome to the return of Who's Better Baseball, the podcast where we talk about who is better at baseball. In this case, which division is best in baseball. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein, managing editor at justbaseball.com. I have Patrick Lyons with me today, and with me throughout the season, my new co-host on Who's Better. Patrick has covered the Rockies. He's going to be covering a lot of NL West teams for us this year. So you got the West Coast bias for us. I got the East Coast bias, right? So we'll see how that conversation takes us throughout the show today.
Yeah, looking forward to it. This is going to be a fun conversation all season long. And my background, truth be told, is from the East Coast. I'm originally from New
Okay.
Jersey. So hopefully my West Coast bias is a little bit balanced out in general. But yeah, it's going to be fun.
It will for sure, man. And I think, talking about coast bias, we've done some research on this. And I think as we're talking about who has the best division in baseball, we're going to eliminate the Centrals, both of them. And the reason why we're doing that, if you look at recent history, the Central has consistently been sort of the weaker spot in this sport. The Cubs are the last team from a Central League to win the World Series. That's when they faced the Guardians in 2016. It's the last time either division had a representative in the World Series. Since 2010, the Cardinals have won 2 World Series, but haven't since 2013. The Tigers made it in 2012 and lost. The Royals had their little run, 2014, 2015, winning it in that second year, but it hasn't been a lot of success from those divisions. And then we look at the wild card race the last 2 years, there has not been a wild card team from either Central Division. So I think when you look at that, when you look at these teams, it's clear that those different divisions are all competing for who wins it to get into the playoffs. But as we saw last year, what was it? The Twins had a worse record than the Mariners, and the Mariners didn't make the playoffs. That's just, I think, the state of things. Can you agree with me on that one, or are we good to just cross off the Centrals?
Yeah, there you really can't make any debate about them being the best division. I think the NL Central will be competitive and
Yeah.
that will be kind of exciting to watch because depending on whether you actually think the Cardinals are the worst team in the NL Central, you could also turn around and say, yeah, they could win it. They could figure out a couple things, and some projection systems even have the Brewers going out and winning the NL Central despite losing a key cog in manager Craig Counsell. So I think, AL and NL Central will be competitive, but if we're having a conversation about who's better and what is the best division, we've spent already too much time discussing them.
Absolutely. And I do agree with you. I think those are some interesting divisions we'll be covering this year because those are wide open races, but they're not the juggernauts to discuss today. So let's go into the coast bias, I say, over the last 5 years. So if you look at playoff teams, the AL West has had 9 playoff teams. We're excluding 2020. So this is 2018, 2019, 2021, 2022, 2023. AL West has had 9 playoff teams. The NL West has had 9 playoff teams. The NL East has had 10 playoff teams. The AL East has consistently been the best division with 13 playoff teams. Although when we get into the actual postseason, the AL East hasn't been as successful. Look at World Series appearances. There's been 4 representatives from the AL West. That's the Astros mostly and the Rangers this past year. The AL East had the Red Sox win it all, of course, in 2018, but it's been a while. The NL West with the Dodgers, couple World Series appearances. The AL East, or excuse me, the NL East has had some appearances and some winners, the Nationals, the Braves. That accounts for 3 World Series appearances. So let's get into what happened last year, though. Last year, you could say the AL East was the best division. This is where we could start to have some conversation about how we measure this. Because in the AL East, they had the Orioles, the Rays, and the Blue Jays all make the playoffs. They had 4 teams with winning records because the Yankees had a winning record. And they had some really high, run differentials as well. The Rays led the American League with a plus 195 run differential. You had the Orioles with a run differential over 100. I think the Blue Jays were the other one with the plus 75 run differential. So a lot of really good teams. Yet when we got to the playoffs, all of a sudden the AL West really showed out because it was an Astros Rangers ALCS, and the Rangers won the World Series. So how do we measure this? Do we measure this more the team success in the regular season, or which teams do we think have the best shot to ultimately win it all?
Yeah, that's really the debate because once you get to the postseason, it really has become a whole new season. And I don't think that's always been true, obviously, for the history of baseball at a point in which if you won the league, you went right to the World Series, right? So, and then the wild card gets injected into that, and that changes the conversation just a little bit. I think it's kind of interesting to think that in the AL East, they're battling against each other just to get a postseason spot into the win of the division. Whereas if you look at teams from last year, the Astros and the Rangers, they were kind of comprised of a little bit more veteran pitching staffs that was once they got in, they were going to lead them through October. And so I wonder how much of that roster management kind of, factors into that. But I think the postseason is a beast unto itself. I do like the conversation as far as saying, hey, what's the best division? Being mostly about what's the best division as far as the regular season goes. Because once that calendar turns to the postseason, anything can happen.
Yeah, I think when you look at that kind of crapshoot that the playoffs can be, getting in is the important thing. So when we're looking at these divisions, it's which division is going to have potentially three representatives because that's obviously going to give them the most cracks at it to ultimately come out victorious. To go through sort of what happened last year in the other divisions, the NL East had three playoff teams: the Braves, the Phillies, and the Marlins. Braves were obviously dominant. The Phillies were great in the playoffs. You look at the NL West, you had Dodgers, D-backs, and D-backs made that magical run to the World Series. And then again, we already referenced what happened in the AL West with the Astros and the Rangers. Now, I want to run through real quick our Just Baseball Power Rankings. This is the first place that anyone's going to get any of it. I'm going to be publishing the article on Tuesday this week as I write it out. But I wanted to share with you my top 10 and actually expand it out to the top 11 because the Rays are right there with the Blue Jays. And that's why I want to do it this way. But going through the top 10, I got Braves, Dodgers, Astros, Orioles, Rangers, Phillies, Yankees, Mariners, Diamondbacks, Blue Jays, and then the Rays right outside the top 10. So if you look at that top 10, you got in the NL East, there's only two teams, Braves, Phillies. You look at the NL West, two teams, Dodgers, D-backs. You look at the AL West, you got Astros, Rangers, Mariners, and then AL East, you have Orioles, Yankees, Blue Jays, but the Rays right there. So, with that in mind, with the fact that the Yankees maybe have the most, or excuse me, not the Yankees, the AL East might have four really interesting playoff teams. Are we still looking at them as the division to beat, so to speak, at kind of the favorite because of what they've done historically and just how many good teams they have from jump here?
I think so. I think that has to be the best division in baseball. As you said, looking at the power rankings, you look at a lot of the projections as well from depending on the site that you look at. The AL East just historically has been the spot where these teams also too. You have to remember once you go into the trade deadline, they are aggressive, right? They do make those moves. They are very much about the now. You don't see, you go back a decade or so ago, that's the AL East was not where you saw teams tank, right?
Okay.
Because every year they had to be competitive, they had to be relevant. They couldn't take a step back for 2, 3, 4 years. So I think the AL East is definitely that spot where again, you've got four teams that are going to be in the mix. And it's wild to think that the Boston Red Sox really aren't going to be in that conversation whatsoever. They're going to get the passion from the fans. And so they might make some things kind of interesting. And if they do, all of a sudden, a couple moves at the trade deadline, all of a sudden, new GM Craig Breslow is going to be a hero in all of New England. So even when you talk about the worst team in the AL East, they still could very much surprise.
And I think that's another interesting point too, because for the most part, I feel like we can sort of discard that fifth team in the division. Like NL East, we're not expecting much from the Nationals. You go to the AL West. What are the A's going to give us this year? I think the Angels have the smallest of chances to put together a good season if Ron Washington does some magic and Mike Trout's healthy. But again, a little more slim. The Red Sox, if we were to just look at this as a complete division, top to bottom, who's the best? The Red Sox would actually kind of tip the scale too, because I think for a fifth place team, they're far more dangerous than anyone else in baseball, probably.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Their starting rotation obviously took a major hit with
Yeah.
Lucas Giolito being down. Little bit of a ragtag group of starting pitchers, but if you really dig a little bit deeper, there's a lot to like. And Brian Bayo obviously just got the extension and Nick Pivetta, so like there's still pieces there. You still got Kenley Jensen and Chris Martin in the back end of that bullpen. So there's still some positive things. Not for Red Sox fans. They're probably shouting right now at their listening device, but as far as fifth place teams go, I don't think the Red Sox are in any danger of losing 100 games, much like the other teams that we're talking about here in the Easts and the Wests.
Yeah, for sure. And let's stay out east because I think we can potentially eliminate the NL East from this conversation. Of course, people watching see the Mets banner behind me. I host Locked On Mets. I have some bias here, but even with that bias, I'm not enough of a believer in what the Mets have done this offseason to really look at them as this huge, huge threat. I think they're one of these teams that has done enough to be able to be in that wild card mix for that last wild card spot potentially, but it's really a division with two teams atop it. And I think when we look at the West, the NL West, the AL West, the AL East, there's at least three really compelling, potential playoff teams. And for the NL East, it's really Braves, who could be the best team in baseball, and Phillies.
The other part of the conversation when trying to predict how good a division is and whatnot is kind of looking into the future and like what are the goals of the organization. Of course, you say, oh, every team wants to go out and win the World Series, and yes, that's true. But with a team like the Mets, and you know this very well, when Steve Cohen came in, you knew they were going to win a World Series between years 5 and 10, and really try to kind of orchestrate themselves as an organization in a similar vein to the Los Angeles Dodgers. And they're not there yet. They haven't been able to do that, and that definitely does take time. But they are now in that period where they're not going to go out and be signing Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander again. And we saw that they didn't do that this offseason. They're very frugal in their signings, and so were they to be in contention, I think you're going to see pretty much this roster intact. There might be some more smaller, frugal moves, kind of like what Atlanta made in 2021, right? They're like, okay, let's bring in Jack Peterson over here, and how about Eddie Rosario? Like, okay, those are good moves, and that did end up winning a championship and then for them in the National League. But you're not going to see those major moves to go out there and be a 90+ win team. So if they get into the playoffs, it will be as a wild card team because of how tough the division is, and because they simply aren't going to be going all in because the future is a little bit more important. That window of contention, right? Having a few years to contend, and you need more players and more younger players to do that. So they're not going to mortgage their future to go all in and do something like that.
No, for sure. That they're they haven't really been trying to trade their prospects the last couple of years. They have gone uh through this route of, like you said, it was the big signings. It was the Scherzer, the Verlander, but it was always the signings because they really do want to preserve that, chance for a sustainable winner. So I think the NL East is going to be an interesting division. They could surprise us if, hey, the Marlins somehow carry over that magic. The Mets are great, but it's not likely to be the best division in baseball. So that brings us to his other three divisions where I think you can make an argument for each one. And I want to go to the AL West now because last year, a lot of playoff success. And if you just look at three teams, the top three teams in the division, Astros, Rangers, Mariners is pretty scary. And I think those three teams alone are enough to at least put them into this conversation legitimately.
Oh, for sure. And the Mariners are a team that, they kind of fell short, obviously, last season. And I find that to be a common trajectory for young up and coming teams where they make a big jump maybe a year early, and then in year two, they take a step back, right? Like that could happen with Cincinnati, who were, above 500 this past year, and they're expected to take another step forward. They actually might take a step back before kind of surging ahead in 2025. So that was kind of the Mariners deal, and they just have such a strong pitching staff. I mean, they've got 7 guys that teams would salivate over. I mean, I think. If we have a conversation about who's better as far as rotations go, or if you were to take a division as far as where a Cy Young award winner is going to come from. I think the AL West is where you'd love to have some stake in that, because guys like George Kirby, Logan Gilbert, and Luis Castillo at the front of that Mariners rotation not only bodes well for that regular season success, but as we were talking about at the start of the show, that postseason success too, where hey, these are horses that you can ride, deep into October for 3-4 series now. And I think that bodes really well for the AL West being strong. Houston does it each and every year, even with Justin Verlander. Those questions, you go, all right, Hunter Brown's probably going to step up, right? They always seem to find those guys. It very much is an Astros way at this point for plugging in the guys into the system and having immediate success in the big league. So yeah, the AL West is dangerous. And now the Rangers too. They're just throwing money at the problems. Hey, it worked in 2023. You have to think that it's probably going to work again in 2024 as well, especially with the influx of the Evan Carter now for a full season and Wyatt Langford. So the Rangers are going to be there as well. That's going to be a really, really strong division to see who's going to win the AL West.
And I actually feel like the Astros, because they've been around so long, are getting a little bit slept on. I know in my power rankings, I had them number 3 behind the Braves and the Dodgers, because you just look and obviously they didn't do too much this offseason, but what they did do is fortify a strength and get Josh Hader. That bullpen with Josh Hader, Abreu, Ryan Presley, I mean, they are so scary late in games, and their lineup has been so consistently good when you have Jordan Alvarez, Jose Altuve, Kyle Tucker, Alex Bregman, and this might even be kind of the last year with the band's together, at least with Bregman potentially hitting free agency. I think the Astros haven't gotten talked about nearly enough this offseason just because they haven't been out there making moves. But I think they could be a really scary team once again. They're always a scary team, but this year in particular, especially after last year being kind of a weird step back after the World Series, I think they can be right back in front in the AL.
Yeah, I had thought going into this year that Bobby Witt Jr. was probably the best player that people aren't talking enough about. He gets the extension, and still, I think people should probably be talking about him more. But to your point about, teams and players getting slept on, I mean, who slept on more than Kyle Tucker, right? Finished one homer shy of 30 home runs last year. Had he gotten there, that's 3 straight years of 30 home runs on the nose, in fact, for his age 24, 25, and 26 season. So he's just a guy that goes out there. He's going to give you 100 RBI, not very flashy, right? Has a left-handed swing that just isn't as beautiful and as exotic as so many other guys left-handed hitting swings, but still, like he's just such an incredibly valuable player. So yeah, I think you're right. There could be something to that, and he's approaching free agency too as well. So Bregman, Tucker, all those guys, that core, you're right. This could be one of their last go rounds. So it's going to make them want to get it done this year more than ever.
I think so. And yeah, that's I definitely we got to keep them squarely in this mix here, looking at the best divisions in baseball because those 3 teams are so exciting. Let's go to the other division out west, the NL West, the Dodgers. Okay, the Dodgers are loaded. They have done so much this offseason to take a great team and make it greater. But what I want to actually focus more on is those other 3 teams below them because sneakily the most aggressive, actually, maybe not sneakily, clearly the most aggressive division in baseball this offseason. The D-backs, the Padres, the Giants, they all made a ton of moves. So I look at those 3 teams in this wild card race, and they all should be featured pretty prominently.
Yeah, that's such a good point about how all three of those teams were aggressive. We know obviously late the Giants getting Matt Chapman, Jorge Soler, Blake Snell, right? You go, okay, yep, those guys were aggressive. Their offseason ended up, turning out to be genius, right? Padres a little bit late, obviously, with the Dylan Cease acquisition after getting rid of Juan Soto. But the Diamondbacks back, pretty much towards the end of 2023 in December, I mean, they made a lot of moves. They brought back Lourdes Gurriel. Eduardo Rodriguez is going to slot in there as their number 3 starter once he's back and healthy. Acquired Eugenio Suarez. So like they made a lot of those moves to say, okay, fine, we're not going to win the division, but we can be the next best team. We can be number 2 in the National League. It's still good for a wild card spot. And all 3 of those teams, you really think something positive can happen. The Padres probably are 4th place, I think, in a lot of people's minds, but and I've heard a lot of people say this, they've almost had bad luck. There's
Yeah.
something going on. Maybe it's a chemistry thing. I don't know. You'd have thought a veteran manager like a Bob Melvin would have been able to figure that out. But there's still so much talent left on that roster, even after some guys, have parted in the Soto deal. Trent Grisham, I think, is a very valuable center fielder, more glove than pop, but even still. The Padres, things could really turn their way. And if they go on and win 90 games, I don't really think anybody would be too surprised with that roster.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And they, you mentioned Grisham there. I was they moved Grisham in that Soto trade, but I think you meant Jackson Merrill coming up there as this top prospect that gets an opening day spot. And I think what's interesting about what the Padres did is they were sort of backed into a corner, right? With that whole article came out, they had to pay that loan or get that loan to pay off their players last year. They were obviously expecting a lot of playoff revenues that never came. And so they were in this position where they had to cut payroll, but their team has so many big salaries. You can't all of a sudden shop Xander Bogaerts and Manny Machado on those contracts. I think they did a really nice job of threading a tough needle of taking Juan Soto and turning him into pitching depth, which is really expensive and was really expensive this offseason to get Michael King, Johnny Brito, Randy Vasquez to really build that out. And then that was enough to be like, all right, we're in the mix. Then they do the Dylan Cease trade. It's like, oh, well, all right. Now they got that three-headed monster atop their rotation where if Darvish can bounce back, Musgrove and Cease now, I think what the Padres have done is if they can actually make it, they will be a very dangerous team in the playoffs with their star power.
Yeah, they almost have a fantasy baseball approach right now with like a stars and scrubs approach, right?
Yeah.
And that's no knock on the guys that are in the scrubs category. They're just not household names. They're not being paid very well. They're just not superstars, right? At least not yet. And so, yeah, as you said, they're basically swapped out Soto for Dylan Cease, 1 year of Juan Soto for 2 years of Dylan Cease. So, overall, you look at the grand scheme of things, that still turns out to be, a really good move for the organization. And again, those stars can absolutely elevate them, and they got athletes all over, right? Everywhere except catcher is a former shortstop, right?
Yeah.
Playing. So I think they still have a really good shot at playing well, and that fan base is ravenous, man. I actually happened to be there at the trade deadline in 2022 when they got Juan Soto and Josh Bell and Brandon Drury and Josh Hader. So I think the legacy of Peter Seidler is still, going to be honored. And if they have a chance to go out and do it, I don't think Ethan Salas is going to be a trade chip, and that's a whole conversation for another day about who's better as far as farm system rankings goes, and we'll cover that, of course. But still, they've got a couple more chips that they can go ahead and trade away to try to make this window work. Obviously, they got so many of these guys for a decade or so more still to come, but that's gonna be on the backside of their career. So right now is when they really need to win, and they've continued to show that, albeit in creative ways, that their window is right now and that they want to contend.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have knocked AJ Preller, and rightfully so, because he makes a lot of big swings and he's come up empty on a fair amount of them. But the fact is, he is such a good scout. The way that he was able to replenish that farm system after the Juan Soto trade so quickly, to be able to a couple years later pull off a Dylan Cease trade, it was really impressive, and it's kept them relevant. And I think looking at the other two, we already mentioned the Diamondbacks. They had that great run, and I guess the question will be, could they be one of those teams that takes a step back? But they did everything they could to avoid it. Mike Hazen talked about how in the World Series, he was looking at himself in the mirror, disappointed when they had to go to a bullpen game. And I do want to shout out Renee Dechtert for writing this in her season preview for us at Just Baseball. And he saw that and said, all right, well, we're not messing around. And they got Erod. They look at the DH spot and something that they could try to address. They get Suarez for third base, Jock Peterson, Randall Grichuk, adding some veterans to a young team. The Diamondbacks absolutely could be one of those teams that takes a step back, because that could be a natural progression. But I think they did the best they could to avoid it with the moves they made.
And Jack Peterson too. We're forgetting. Like,
Yeah.
there are so many of those really quality veteran guys to come in and give them that postseason experience, because that I think was an element to it last year, where they would have to turn to Emmanuel Rivera or Pavin Smith in some big spots, and they were able to get it done. That when you talk about the best teams when it comes to, or the best divisions when it comes to the postseason, you have to put some respect on both the Rangers and the Diamondbacks, because sure, Zach Gallen, Merrill Kelly, now people know them a little bit more, but they were able to get the job done in the postseason. So you bring in Eduardo Rodriguez, and you've got another year of Brandon Pfaadt, who was a godsend obviously for this team. So yeah, they really have a lot of those pieces in place, and so many of those young guys should only get better going forward. And you got a sleeper rookie of the year award pick in Jordan Lawler as a guy that can come off not off the bench, but come out of the minors and immediately make an impact, and then push a guy who was an all-star last year in Perdomo to a utility spot. So they've got the depth there. They definitely got in starting pitching despite the Erod injury. So Tommy Henry and Ryan Nelson will both make that rotation. So it's hard to say that a team that went to the World Series last year is sneaky good, but I'll say it, the Diamondbacks are still sneaky good.
They really are. They really are. And the Giants, along with these late additions, we forgot they also added Jung Hoo Lee and Jordan Hicks. And I think that rotation, if Jordan Hicks can make that transition, and look, no one's going to doubt this stuff. I mean, when you're throwing 102-mile-per-hour sinkers, it's tough to hit those. And I think, he might have to taper that back to 99 to get through 5 innings. But even then, he could be a real weapon for them out of that rotation while you still now have this 1-2 punch of Webb and Snell, another foreshadowing of probably a future Who's Better episode, best duos atop a rotation in baseball. They'll be in that conversation. So I think as we look at this NL West, they definitely have it when it comes to just teams that are going into this year feeling like they can make the playoffs. And when they get there, they can make a run.
Yeah, not much to add about that. You nailed it, right? The pieces are in place, strong bullpen of veteran guys coming back. The Rogers twins, are doing it from the right and left side. Like the pieces are there. They brought in the big manager. They brought in big Bob Melvin there, to go ahead and make it all add up. And even with the free agents that they were able to sign, these guys are all still playing for their next contract, right? With all the opt
Yeah.
outs. So in a way, they're able to have their cake and eat it too. It's really the best of both worlds. And you've got some young guys that they're injecting into the rotation, and Keaton Winn and Kyle Harrison. So it's a really good balance there in San Francisco.
Now, what I want to do looking at that division with 4 teams, I want to bring it all the way back to the beginning, the AL East, because there's 4 teams there, like we mentioned. And we're going to table the Red Sox again. We're going to look at Orioles, Yankees, Rays, Blue Jays. I think atop the division, the Orioles look unbelievable. And they're a team that, even though they had a good offseason, they got Corbin Burns. I mean, it was an amazing trade. I feel like they still could have made another move. And now the new ownership comes in. Who knows? Maybe they sign Jordan Montgomery next week to bolster this rotation further. Maybe at the deadline, they finally trade some more prospects and get a Shane Bieber, whoever's out there at the deadline as a top pitcher. This Baltimore Orioles team, between what they have on the MLB roster and what's going on in AAA, they're absolutely loaded. So we know that for sure. My question is these other 3 teams, kind of comparing similar to the NL West there. Yankees, Rays, Blue Jays. Which of those teams jumps out to you right now? Or do all of them?
The Yankees don't jump out, right? And the Garrett Cole injury is obviously a major concern, because now you've got Carlos Rodon as your ace. I mean, okay, yeah, Marcus Stroman they did bring in, so that should be helpful. But I sort of like the depth of Toronto. They're bringing that staff back, and they've got 2 more bites at the apple before Bo Bichette and Vlad Guerrero Jr. become a free agent, right? We'll see if they can lock those guys up to an extension, but I don't know. They're too close at this point, I think, for something like that to happen. Tampa Bay. I'm still waiting. We're almost approaching year 30, and there's still not a really good quality Tampa Bay Rays podcast out there. If you know of one, please submit it our way. Maybe Lockdown Rays is good. You'd have a better idea than I do, Ryan. But it's like it's one of those rosters where it's just so much turnover. You might not know the guys very well. They don't have a huge track record of success, but then when they get up to the majors, all of a sudden, you've got just star after star after star between Randy Rosarena off the scrap heap from the Cardinals. There's just one after another. It continues to happen. But I know the names on Toronto. I know what they've been able to do these last few off seasons. I really like their starting rotation 1 through 5. Would be a little bit better, of course, with a healthy and somewhat normalized 2022 All-Star version of Alek Manoah. But he's obviously a big piece that can come back up and contribute. So, Toronto has all the pieces there, and so I think of the 3 between Toronto, the Yankees, and Tampa Bay, I would trust Toronto the most right now.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. You look at that rotation, like you said, it's so dependable. I mean, you're talking about If you wanted to go around the game and say, who are the best sort of really good innings eaters that are going to give you not only the innings, but quality innings, the opposite of Lance Lynn last year. You got Kevin Gossman, Chris Bassett, and Jose Barrios, who had an amazing bounce back. And then even, if Manoah doesn't work out, like they have one of the best pitching prospects in baseball, and Ricky Tiedemann. So they have a lot going for them. And also, I liked how you mentioned the 2 years away from free agency. This is also the time where Bo Bichette and Vladdy need to make their money. So I could see a world where one of those guys is a top five MVP finisher. Obviously, Vladdy was able to well, he was second to Shohei, right? He put up an MVP season, but he didn't pitch. So they have that in them, and I think they're really interesting. The Rays are this team where it's like you almost they've been underrated for so long they become overrated in the sense that you just expect it to work out. Like I don't know how they're going to get to 95 plus wins, but they're going to get to 95 plus wins. It's just going to happen. It is interesting that as we're looking at this AL East, the team that has dominated this division in this sport historically is the one that we got the questions with, and they're the ones that have the best duo of hitters in baseball, Aaron Judge and Juan Soto. It's going to be amazing to see. But in that trade for Juan Soto, they gut their pitching depth and then they lose their ace. It's just been a very, very strange offseason for the Yankees.
Yeah, going back to the Rays, you could probably argue they had one of the worst off seasons, right? They lose their ace in Tyler Glass now, and they don't do very much. Asterisk. Let's come back to at the end of the season and talk about a guy like they just acquired from the Rockies and in Joe Rock, for a guy that wasn't going to make the opening day roster in Greg Jones. So Tampa Bay always definitely finds a way to do it, and the Yankees are always right there too, where as soon as you put on those pinstripes, and this well as the crosstown team, covering the Mets, that once you put those pinstripes on, all of a sudden you become otherworldly, right? From Shane Spencer to Kevin Maas going back in the 80s, you just magically become a superstar. So I think that is going to happen for a guy like Trent Grisham, right, who is very much overlooked in San Diego. And they've got 4 or 5 outfielders right now. Giancarlo Stanton, you talk about the best two hitters, any 1-2 punch, Giancarlo Stanton, if you believe what you've been able to see down at spring training, dropping some weight. I mean, that could give you 340 home run hitters right there between Soto, Judge, and Stanton. So as long as those guys can stay healthy, the Yankees always seem to find a way to get it done. It's just expectations are higher. That's the Yankee way. So yeah, at the end of the day, if you're talking about variability, there's probably less for the Yankees. But if you're talking about a ceiling, they still fall behind, I think, Toronto. But if you look at the law of averages, like you said, they're always there each and every year. The Yankees are probably going to be all right somehow they will.
Yeah, no, I mean, can't even remember the last time they had a losing season, right? It was so long ago. I know last year they still kind of squeaked one in there, but looking at, now trying to decide which is the best division. Let's focus on the two AL ones first here because there's going to be 6 playoff spots. One of them's going to go to the Central, so we got 5 here. Which division has the better chance at having the 3 playoff teams? Do we believe enough in Astros, Rangers, Mariners that we'd say, hey, even though there's 4 teams vying for it in the AL East, is the West better because they have 3 better teams, collectively than the best 3 teams in the AL East?
Well, if you consider strength of schedule, which I think used to be a much bigger factor, right? The AL East teams are going, we're going to beat up on each other so much. Now they're down to what, 19 games a year. So that's really kind of reduced that the beating up, if you will, right? And so now everyone's playing the National League, the same amount of times, and the fact that there is so much compression there in the AL East, that the teams are so good, that just means they're all going to eat up those wins against National League foes, NL Central as or AL Central as they typically do. So I think that really bodes well for them. The AL West does have that advantage of playing the Angels and the Oakland soon to be Las Vegas Athletics. So that benefits them. But I think the fact that there are 4 teams in the AL East, and they are aggressive as they typically can be at the trade deadline. I think that gives them that slight edge, despite the fact that there's one extra postseason contender that they have to play in their division. I would give that edge to the AL East over the AL West.
I think I agree with you. I do. If we were framing this conversation of which division will produce a World Series winner, I might go the other way and look at the AL West
Same,
because
same.
you look at the Astros and their experience, you look at if the Rangers can get in, if they can get in and their rotation's healthy, that second half, I'm so fascinated by the first half, second half Rangers. I mean, that's a whole other conversation for another day, but if they could actually get to a playoff rotation with Scherzer, DeGrom, Evaldi, I mean, it could be really special, but they got to get there. And I don't know if they're going to get there. The Mariners, we already talked about the pitching, but like you said, there's four in the AL East, there's three in the AL West. So let's now compare two divisions that have four playoff teams, the AL East versus the NL West. Let's actually do this top to bottom here. So who do you like more, Orioles or the Dodgers?
The Dodgers.
Yeah.
Now, as someone who, here in Colorado had to suffer, Dodgers and Dodgers fans and things of that nature. I like any team other than the Dodgers, right? But of
Yeah.
course, I have an unbiased cap that I wear. But yeah, no, the Dodgers are definitely the class. And it's hard to even say who would you like more in 2025, 2026, and 2027, because those Orioles guys are they're only getting better. They're approaching their prime, but even still, 2024. Okay, let's keep it simple. I'll give the Dodgers over the Orioles, but only slightly. Only slightly.
Yeah, I think the Orioles are going to be a really amazing team to figure out what combination ultimately gets the playing time. And, Jackson Holiday, Colby Mayo, all these different guys that are going to try to force the veterans out. And I am very curious what happens at the trade deadline with new ownership, because I think new ownership could force them to be very aggressive. And that might change just a little bit if the Orioles become the big winners of the deadline that say, hey, we're going for it because they have such an incredible amount of capital to make moves if they chose to. But right now it's the Dodgers. With that said, when we now look at those other three teams below them, that's where I think this is interesting. D-backs, Padres, Giants, Yankees, Rays, Blue Jays. Not in that order necessarily, but which of those kind of crops are the better teams?
That's rough. That's even harder. I think that's and even closer of a comparison. I probably would give a slight edge to the teams in the AL East again, just because of that track record, right? The Rays are basically the poor man's version of the Dodgers, where they always figure it out. They always get it going. And again, they have that track record. Whereas the Diamondbacks are the new kids on the block when it comes to being a postseason contender. The Giants, they came out of nowhere with 107 wins there, and and won the NL West just a couple years ago. But other than that, they've been on the quiet side, and then the Padres, I've only been able to do it that one time. So there's more of that pedigree in the AL East. So I like the upside of the NL West teams more than the AL East, but I think if you're looking at their floor, and again going back to like the law of averages, if you were to do a Stratomatic and do 1,000 simulations of the 2024 season, I would give that slight edge to the AL East actually. How about you?
It's we did this entire exercise, and I was hoping we'd come to an answer that wasn't kind of chalk. It wasn't. It's the AL East again. But yeah, if you look at it from this lens, all right, let's compare these other three teams to each other. I think in the AL East, all four of those teams, I'm pretty confident are going to be winning teams and going to be within a couple games of that wild card. I feel pretty good that all of them are going to be 85 plus win teams. In the NL West, even though I like the Diamondbacks, the Padres, and the Giants, I feel like one of those three teams is not going to have the season we expect. I think one of those three teams might end up being a losing team when it's all said and done, where things just don't work. And because of that, because I think also, um, they might have the three playoff teams, but I think the AL East just is a little bit deeper, and there's I think a higher floor, like you kind of mentioned there, a higher floor with those four teams compared to the floor of the NOS. So unfortunately, I think we're saying here once again, despite all the additions the NOS made, despite some exciting teams in the AL West with the Astros, Rangers, and Mariners, the AL East is still the best division in baseball. I don't think they're going anywhere either.
Yeah, we did our due diligence. We balanced it out. We tried to make it work. But yeah, no, the AL East is where it's at. It's where it's been, and it's where it's going to stay.
Absolutely. So moving forward here with who's better, this is a channel that we haven't had much go out throughout this offseason, but we're going to be back full swing this season. We're going to try to do 3 days a week on the audio side, and we'll be breaking up some of our episodes into some smaller YouTube videos. So there should be constant content coming to this YouTube channel. I think we're going to look at the off seasons next, so we'll get a little bit more in depth on what each of these teams did to improve, sort of preview out this season later this week. So make sure if you're watching, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future content. Find our podcast feed. I think that's going to be a little bit slower. We'll get it up by the end of this week, but that's going to be a little bit behind the YouTube channel. And we'll be rolling throughout the season. I'm excited to have Patrick on with me, and we're going to have a lot of fun discussing who's better in baseball in 2024.